Out front of Osgoode Hall, where the week-long constitutional reference is taking place, one of the interveners in this case is the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, represented at least in part by lawyer Christine Van Geyn, with whom I've had the pleasure of chatting on many occasions, but never in this attire. So thanks very much for taking the time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So really, in a nutshell here, I know interveners haven't been given a huge amount of time, but what is the Canadian Taxpayers Federation's approach to this question?
Yeah, so we've been given about 10 minutes, and we'll be making our arguments on Wednesday. We're adopting everything that the Ontario Attorney General has said, and we're going to be expanding upon their argument about whether or not this is a tax. We're arguing that it is a tax in pith and substance, but it's not properly enacted because it's not enacted explicitly. Taxes need to be enacted explicitly by Parliament. This is really enacted sort of as a skeleton regime with all of the details, when it applies, who it applies to, and how much it applies. That's all filled in by regulation instead of enacted explicitly by Parliament. So it's neither a valid tax nor is it a regulatory charge, and we're concerned for taxpayers because if you give the federal government the power to enact things that are essentially taxes, but they don't need to comply with constitutional requirements, and the government can just call them regulatory charges, that's going to be a big problem in the future, and we shouldn't empower the federal government that way.
If the federal government has the authority to levy taxes and to levy regulatory charges, why does that distinction matter here if the government has the ability to do it?
Because they need to do it properly. That's what our Constitution requires. And we're going to be arguing on Wednesday that they haven't met those constitutional requirements. If you want to do something, you need to comply with the Constitution. That's what it's there for. And we're proud to be here to stand up for taxpayers and say that they deserve that.
One of the things that came up when Ontario was delivering its opening arguments is this idea that the carbon tax, as currently put forward in the legislation, tends to occupy this twilight zone where, and there was actually an exchange with the Associate Chief Justice about this, it's not really a tax in the eyes of the law, it's not really a regulatory charge. My question as someone who's not a lawyer coming into this is, for Canadians, that distinction is not particularly relevant. I mean, that idea of a tax in practice not being a tax in law seems like a confusing one for the people that are paying for it.
Yeah, so I think if you talk to anyone who's filling up their car at a gas station, they're going to say this feels like a tax, and that's what we mean when we use the term in pith and substance. This is something that it acts like a tax, it feels like a tax, it is a tax, and the thing that matters if the government's going to impose a tax is that they impose it in a way that meets the constitutional requirements set out in our Constitution. So the government needs to comply with that, and that's what we're asking for.
The nightmare scenario, let's say that the court rules on Ontario's side and ultimately on your side on this, could the federal government reintroduce the identical legislation but call it a tax and it would be in the clear?
Yeah, if they were explicit in how they enacted this, if they enacted a proper taxing power, then it could be, depending on what they did. I mean, it's hard to comment on hypothetical legislation, but if they did do things properly, it would be a different story. The thing is, in this legislation, they haven't.
And that, I think, is so central to what you said earlier about the fairness to taxpayers here, is that if you are going to put a tax on people, you need to be a lot more forthright about it.
Yeah, we call it taxation only with representation, right? It's a very fundamental principle of our Constitution.
So I know it's not advantageous to necessarily predict how the week is likely to unfold, but I know that some of the interveners have put forward their own positions on this, as you have, but their perspective is more about the urgency of climate action and not about the constitutionality of it. Are those taken into consideration in a court case like this?
I mean, those seem to be policy issues and policy questions that are not necessarily legal issues, but they're couched in legal terms. In my view, this is really a question of jurisdiction and constitutionality. When we get into kind of unwritten principles, which some of the interveners are arguing, you're on a lot shakier ground.
Ontario Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, Christine Van Geyn, thanks for your work and thanks for your time.
Thank you.